touch of frost in places, but most towns and cities holding up between 4 and 8 Celsius. Then for tomorrow, it's a mostly dry picture across the country. We'll start to pick up quite a brisk and gusty easterly wind, and this will bring in areas of cloud off the North Sea from time to time. Not cloudy everywhere, but I think more cloud for many places what we'll see through the course of today. And again, the coasts of eastern Scotland and north east England could be quite grey and misty for much of the day. Now, temperatures down a notch on Thursday compared to what we'll see this afternoon, but still highs of 17 or 18 Celsius. Now, for the end of the week, we've got low pressure diving down towards the Bay of Biscay, being some very unsettled weather here. High pressure to the north of the UK, and the net effect of this is a brisk easterly flow. You can see the little bumps in the isobars here, always a sign that to the west of high ground, could see some quite gusty conditions. This will feed in areas of cloud, but some sunny spells for Thursday. More cloud, though, generally for Friday and Saturday. A few showers by this stage as well. And whilst west is generally best for temperatures, generally speaking, it's a bit cooler.
Tonight on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Dubes & Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Dubes & Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's 2 questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and radio. Well, what a day in Parliament it was yesterday. This morning, I'll speak to the MP who became the centrepiece of Sir Keir Starmer's response to the Prime Minister. I'll also speak to the editor of the Sunday Mirror and the deputy editor of Conservative Home. You won't want to miss it. All to come after the morning headlines.
A very good morning. It's 9:31. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date. Now, Russia has issued another deadline for Ukrainian and foreign fighters to surrender in the besieged port city of Mariupol. Ukrainian commanders have vowed not to give up the final stronghold in the city. Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister says Moscow could allow civilians to leave with a preliminary agreement for a humanitarian corridor today. In an overnight address, the President Volodymyr Zelensky appealed again for weapons and condemned Russia's attacks.
In this war, the Russian army will forever inscribe itself in world history as perhaps the most barbaric and inhuman army in the world, deliberately killing civilians, destroying residential quarters and civilian infrastructure, and using all kinds of weapons, including those prohibited by international conventions, is already the brand signature of the Russian army. And this is such meanness, which for generations will mark the Russian state as a source of absolute evil.
The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson won't be in Westminster when MPs vote over whether to start an investigation into claims he misled Parliament. Well, Boris Johnson's expected to travel to India later today on a planned official visit. MPs will vote after the Prime Minister was fined by police for breaching COVID rules at a birthday in June 2020. Boris Johnson has apologised but insists he didn't know he was breaking any rules. Well, he'll face MPs in the Commons later today. We'll bring that to you here on GB News. Prince Harry says the Queen was on great form when he and his wife Meghan visited her in Windsor last week. He was speaking to the American broadcaster NBC today, and the Duke of Sussex said he wanted to make sure Her Majesty was protected and had the right people around her. Netflix has lost subscribers for the first time in over a decade. 200,000 subscribers left the streaming giant in the first quarter of this year. Well, Netflix also chose to stop operating in Russia earlier in March after they started the war in Ukraine. Well, that resulted in the loss of 700,000 members. You're up to date on GB News, but on your TV, online and DAB+ radio. Now let's head over to Tom for this morning's briefing.
Well, a very good morning to you. It's 9:33 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and on your radio. Well, the Prime Minister faced the Commons yesterday for the first time since the Met issued that famous fixed penalty notice for what they determined to be a gathering in breach of lockdown restrictions in the Cabinet room. In response to his repeated apology, Labour Party leader Sir Keir Starmer called on the Prime Minister to resign and described the apology as a joke. After initially facing heckles from Tory benches, the Labour leader then silenced the Commons when he told an emotional story about a man from Lichfield. Let's take a listen.
This morning, I spoke to John Robinson, a constituent of the member for Lichfield. I want to tell you his story. When his wife died of COVID, John and his family obeyed the Prime Minister's rules. He didn't see her in hospital. He didn't hold her hand as she died. But John would have given the world to hold his dying wife's hand, even if it was just for 9 minutes. But he didn't, because he followed the Prime Minister's rules.
Well, at that moment, you could have heard a pin drop in the House of Commons. Clearly, an emotional moment, and indeed one that the MP for that constituent, Mr Michael Fabricant, addressed later in the House as well. I'm delighted to say that Michael Fabricant joins me on the programme now, of course, the Conservative MP for Lichfield. Michael, just to start off, how did you feel when Sir Keir Starmer named you in his response?
Well, he named me twice. I was bemused that, you know, at the end of the day, I'm a backbencher. Twice in his speech he mentioned me earlier on, and then he mentioned me a second time, and I was surprised. I mean, I sort of remember looking down and thinking, my God, you know, he's obsessed with me. I've got under his skin. I don't know why, because I don't think I've been any more voluble about things than other people, so I was very surprised, but sad to hear about John Robinson.
You have become known as one of the most fervent defenders of the Prime Minister, popping up on news channels defending the Prime Minister. And one of the defences that you cited was, of course, the fact that it wasn't just the Prime Minister who happened to have a birthday. Other key workers may well have had birthdays. There are some examples publicly available of that. Sir Keir Starmer criticised you of that, saying it was, in effect, an attack on teachers and nurses. What would you say to that?
No, it's not meant to be an attack at all. I mean, first of all, I would say that, you know, people say, oh, the Prime Minister made those rules, he should have understood them. I mean, it has to be said that very, very senior civil servants have also appeared to have broken those rules in the number 10 Downing Street setting. And I think it's because the assumption was made at the time that because they were all working together, they weren't breaking any rules. The point I had made, and I think what Keir Starmer was referring to, was I said that I was aware, and since I said what I said, I've become even more aware because people have written to me about it from all parts of the country, that a few nurses and a few teachers, after a long, gruelling, hard day, met up afterwards. I think they took a similar view, that they'd been working together. I'm not condemning them. In fact, I'm understanding for them. None of them were drunk. I never made that accusation. And yet it seems to have got very out of hand. You know, there are some 500,000 nurses in the UK and 625,000 teachers. So to claim that not one single nurse or not one single teacher broke a technical rule seems to me a bit naive, actually. And it's certainly, as I say, no condemnation of any nurses or teachers who I think have done a very hard and difficult job during the COVID period, all of them.
No, certainly. On this programme earlier in the week, I've spoken about a nurse who was celebrated in the local press for having a birthday party. Her colleagues brought her in a cake. She was working on the wards. It seemed like a nice thing. It's interesting that that's been turned into an attack. But I do want to move this conversation on because, of course, John Robinson was the name that silenced the Commons. It was a horrific story, a man who wasn't able to see a dying loved one. However, I'm not entirely convinced it's an entirely apt comparison to what took place in the 19th of June in the Cabinet Room of Downing Street. For those watching on television, not just listening on radio, we will be able to see on our screens now a graphic from the CPS, which was describing the change in regulations. And indeed, the regulations changed on the 13th of June, a week before that event in the Cabinet Room, saying that individuals may see another person they reasonably believe is dying. They could see that person in a setting of a hospital or a hospice or a home or indeed a care home. Those regulations had changed as part of lockdown easing. Yet, why didn't the Prime Minister mention that?
He probably wasn't aware of it. You know, the rules were constantly changing as the strength of the COVID pandemic ebbed and gained and flowed backwards and forwards, so the legislation had to react. And I know many people were confused by what was actually the legislation at the time. And of course, what was legislation in England was different in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And as I said, it was simply because... And people criticised it. I saw the press were criticising, why does the government keep chopping and changing with the rules? Why? Because it had to react quickly to the strength of the pandemic. And when it weakened, they made it looser, and when they strengthened... But, you know, I just find the whole thing extraordinary when, as I said, civil servants themselves were attending many of these events in Downing Street and elsewhere, thinking that they weren't breaking the rules. And, you know, 2 years ago, and I think you tweeted about it, Tom, 2 years ago, The Times published an article mentioning the fact that a birthday cake had appeared in the Cabinet Room. Nobody raised a hue and cry then. It's all happened now. And, you know, the saddest thing of all, I think, is the way that Keir Starmer and other politicians have chosen to weaponise the personal tragedies endured by people like John Robinson. And, you know, I would have thought actually that was pretty beneath him.
It's fascinating to see the very visceral public reaction to all of this. Of course, people hear the word party and they probably think of something quite different to a muted event with people you're in the same room anyway for work purposes. Do you understand how the public perceives so much of this debate, thinking back to the trials and tribulations and indeed the heartache that so many people suffered during it? It almost doesn't wash that whether the regulations had changed by this point or that point, whether this was in Tier 1 or when in shops were opening or when people were allowed to come round for interior decoration or anything else. It almost doesn't matter what the particulars are because people seem to have just decided that there's hypocrisy here.
Yes, it's such an emotional issue, and the word partygate has become, you know, part of our vocabulary. And as you quite rightly say, when I think of a party, I think of people blowing party poppers and drinking and rolling around, you know, with friends and all the rest of it. And it was nothing like that. But people aren't interested in that. But, you know, I think now the strength of feeling is very strong. I suspect as things drift on, you know, we'll move on to other issues. I think most thoughtful people realise this is very different. And I'll say again for a third time, the senior civil servants all thought it was legal. And that's why, incidentally, I will be voting tomorrow to say that I believe that the Prime Minister was not misleading the House because he had been told by his civil servants, the very people who drew up the legislation, what you are doing in Downing Street is perfectly legal. And we're participating too. So, you know, I don't think he has a case to answer as far as misleading the House is concerned. And I'll say one other thing. Chris Bryant, who I have, you know, I'm very fond of Chris Bryant. He and I were on a committee for a long time together. But some of the things that Chris has tweeted about the Prime Minister doesn't bear repeating.
And he would be adjudicating this case.
He is the chairman of the committee that will be voting on tomorrow. You know, this is not an unbiased judge. So apart from the fact that I don't personally believe he misled the House anyway, because he was taking civil servants' advice, to give it to a committee chaired by Chris Bryant and some of the other people who've already made their views clear would, to me, be a nonsense and a miscarriage of justice.
Well, it will be fascinating to see how that vote goes through. Of course, tomorrow we're expecting it. Today we're expecting to see the wording of that Labour motion. But for now, Michael Fabricant, thank you so much for talking us through that fascinating day yesterday in Parliament. Well, turning now to some more views on exactly what happened yesterday and how this may well affect our politics going into the future. I'm delighted to say that we're joined now by the political editor of the Sunday Mirror and the Sunday People. Nigel Nelson joins us now. Welcome to the programme, Nigel. What did you make of what Michael Fabricant had to say there?
Well, I rather thought I'd like to go to one of his parties. They sound rather good. I think that you can't get away from the fact that Boris Johnson was the rule maker and therefore shouldn't be the rule breaker. Now, I do appreciate that some of the rules were a bit confusing at the margins. I think the basic ones at the time made sense. As a result of that, the public were prepared to follow them. But you still have this problem that regardless of whether the rules were right or wrong or whatever, that Boris Johnson should have known what they were. Certainly that the people who worked in Number 10 should know what they were. They should be setting an example. And I don't think it's good enough to say, oh, well, it was only a minor breach or whatever. We've got to wait and see whether the Met Police will come up with other fines for the Prime Minister when he could be in real trouble. With the vote tomorrow probably will go the Prime Minister's way. He's heavily whipping his own party. And of course, one of the major problems of that for Tories who actually want to get rid of him is if they vote to send him to the Privileges Committee, they could well be lose the whip in the parliamentary party. And of course, that means their letter of no confidence doesn't mean a jot. Their letter won't count anymore. So we find the extraordinary situation about tomorrow's vote where Tory MPs who have written letters of no confidence in the Prime Minister, who want to get rid of him, will have to vote to stop him going to Privileges Committee. So as I say, I just don't think that one's going to go anywhere.
That's fascinating. You think it's a real prospect that people who may vote with Sir Keir Starmer tomorrow may well lose the Conservative whip?
Yes, well, it's happened before, hasn't it? I mean, but just before the 2019 election, Boris Johnson withdrew the whip from a number of MPs. That caused them real difficulties because obviously, as the election approached, they couldn't actually stand as a Tory MP in their constituency unless they got the whip back. So if you break a three-line whip, the penalty for that is to lose the whip. Doesn't mean that he would necessarily do it, but that threat is out there. And that means that those people, we know of 14 who have put letters in, I suspect it's probably somewhere in the region of 25 or 30, they will have to vote for the government if they want those letters to count.
I suppose for many Conservatives listening to this, particularly Conservative MPs, there's a sense of frustration that the Prime Minister has had a penalty issued for what is widely perceived to be a relatively minor breach of the rules, especially in the case of the Chancellor, who had no idea he'd be receiving a fixed penalty notice. And yet for other minor breaches of the rules made by other politicians, whether it was Sir Keir Starmer having a beer with work colleagues at what he described as a work event during restrictions, or Nicola Sturgeon on a number of occasions being pictured and videoed without a mask indoors in a setting that she had legislated the mandatory wearing of masks within. Those politicians were cleared by the police, and yet Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak were issued fixed penalty notices. Do you think there's a sense of injustice there?
Well, I actually do think that Rishi Sunak was treated a bit harshly. Quite clearly, he was going into Number 10 for a meeting. He was ushered into a room for the Prime Minister's birthday, popped his head round the door, had a soft drink, and ends up with a fine. So yes, I do think that he was slightly unlucky on that one, but it obviously was a breach of the law. Now, when you mention what Keir Starmer and Nicola Sturgeon have done, neither is up there with holding a fully fledged party. And what we do know in Number 10 is that there were parties going on, there were tables groaning with alcohol, there was cheese and wine being passed round at different events. So there's a slightly, that's a much more serious kind of offence than anything that Keir Starmer or Nicola Sturgeon committed. Nicola Sturgeon forgot to put on her mask. Yes, it was a breach of the rules, up to the police whether they wanted to take that further. Keir Starmer had a beer and a pizza with a few people he was working with afterwards. Doesn't qualify as a party. I think we're in a different kind of position with Number 10. And again, we go back to the fact that Number 10 should really be, as the rule makers, really assiduous about keeping the rules, which they clearly didn't.
Yes, I suppose you could make the argument, however, that Sir Keir Starmer did vote for those rules, was to that extent an accomplice in creating those rules. Without those parliamentary votes, those rules would not have become law. And yet that has somehow been seen as a different event. Let's move this conversation on a little bit to how the public may be reacting to this, because we could talk technicalities all day, but ultimately most people sitting at home will just hear the word party and not think well of this government. Do you think there's the chance for this government to move on, or will this always be an administration marred by partygate?
I just think partygate is going to be long-lived. I don't think it's something that people are actually going to forget in any hurry. And obviously, we've got local elections just around the corner on May the 5th, when the public actually have the poll that really matters, which is an election, and they can actually express their views there. What was interesting about being in the Commons yesterday and talking to Tory MPs were just how many of them had emails from constituents really, really angry about what had happened. And the point that MPs were making was these weren't just sort of the usual suspects. It wasn't a kind of round robin that had been got up by some kind of campaign group. These were ordinary constituents who were just furious about the way that they had kept to the rules, only to discover that Number 10 didn't. So that has swayed a lot of Tory MPs about the seriousness of this. So yes, I think that what they're doing is they will be waiting for the local election results. They voted for Boris Johnson as leader because he was a vote winner. If he turns out to be a vote loser on May the 5th, I think they may rethink whether they've got the right Prime Minister.
Well, it certainly will be a fascinating aftermath of those 5th of May elections. We'll keep a close eye on that campaign trail, only a few weeks away now. But for now, Nigel Nelson, political editor of the Sunday Mirror and the Sunday People, thanks for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Now, as we mentioned briefly earlier in a discussion, Mark Harper, a former chief whip under David Cameron turned leading COVID rebel under Boris Johnson, announced yesterday that he had submitted a letter of no confidence in Boris Johnson. He said, "We have a Prime Minister who broke the laws that he told the country they had to follow, hasn't been straightforward about it, and is now going to ask decent men and women of these benches to defend what I think is indefensible. I'm very sorry to say this, but I no longer think he is worthy of the great office he holds." Well, let's talk how prevalent that view is on the Conservative benches now with the Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill, who joins me now. Henry, welcome to the programme. Mark Harper was a lone voice yesterday. However, we know for a fact he's not the only one who's submitted a letter. It's always very hard to read the runes of just how many letters have gone in. Where does the temperature sit on this one?
I mean, Conservative MPs, given their historic reputation for ruthlessness, are showing Boris Johnson an awful lot of forbearance, really. I mean, even at the initial height of Partygate, they didn't manage to get sufficient letters in to trigger a leadership contest or a challenge. Since then, some of the letters have been withdrawn, notably by Douglas Ross, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, who's taken out his letter. And now, as you say, he's actually been fined, and as far as we know, only one additional letter has gone in. I think that there is a real desperate willingness on the part of Tory MPs to try and grit their teeth and see the Prime Minister through this. I'm not sure it's going to be possible, because the Met Police are investigating more incidents. It looks as if they're going to issue the fines on an incident-by-incident basis, which means that Boris Johnson could be called back to the House of Commons several more times to issue, suitably humble apologies and explanations for his actions on each and every occasion. But for now, they seem to be gritting their teeth, trying to get through it.
I suppose on the one hand, multiple fines and indeed multiple potentially Commons statements really emphasises how serious this is. On the other, will people really react in a very different way to a further fine than this first one? People have decided he broke the rules for the main part. He's apologised. Just how many more times do we have a Groundhog Day situation, and how much does that actually move the needle?
Well, I think the important thing for Tory MPs to remember, because I think some of them are in danger of mistaking the fact that they haven't got rid of Boris Johnson for the idea that he's somehow getting away with Partygate. This has already done enormous damage to the Prime Minister and to the party at large. You need only compare his poll rating and the party's poll rating to where it stood in November, before they shot themselves with the foot in Owen Paterson and set all this off, to see that many, many voters have changed their mind about the Conservatives and about the Prime Minister. And so it might be that simply having this drip feed of bad stories and apologies doesn't necessarily move the needle, but that's because the needle is already quite a long way down. They're underpolling Labour at the moment. The Prime Minister's personal ratings are well down. But it's also just a question of, when he spoke in the House of Commons yesterday, Boris Johnson offered an explanation for why he thought that specific incident didn't break the rules. Now, you can take or leave that explanation as according to your inclination, but it gets harder to do the more of these incidents there are. So there are 5 or 6. There are 5 or 6, then that becomes very awkward to defend, especially if it means the story is in the press all the way up to the local elections and potentially the Wakefield by-election as well.
Now, we do actually only have 30 seconds left on the programme, so in a couple of words, if you will. We've spent the whole programme talking about parties, and yet yesterday we heard that the UK will have the lowest growth next year in the G7. Should we be talking about other issues?
I mean, we should. The government is in trouble in all sorts of ways, but I think the problem with Partygate, and this is part of the Prime Minister's problem, the more he has to firefight this, the less he can focus on other issues. That is ultimately his fault.
Well, it's a strong determination there. Let's see what the MPs do, of course, tomorrow and going into the future. It's the end of the show, I'm afraid, but thanks for joining us, Henry Hill. Coming up, it's To The Point, but first, here's the weather.
Hello, good morning. I'm Stephen Keats with your latest Met Office forecast. The next few days offer a warmer day today, but then it will turn cloudy towards the end of this week as we pick up this brisk easterly wind and temperatures for some of us coming down a bit. But first thing this morning, though, we've got a fair amount of sunshine out there, particularly for parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland once the fog lifts. Elsewhere, of course, England and Wales, variable amounts of clouds. It won't be sunny everywhere, but most places will see some sunshine at times through the day. Perhaps a cloud across parts of Wales and southwest England, thick enough in the afternoon for a few showers, but far less showers than what we saw through the course of yesterday. And for many of us, it will be a warmer day away from East Coast with that breeze coming in off the sea. Highs in the south this afternoon, probably 18, 19, perhaps 20 degrees. Now, any showers we do have during this evening will soon fade away.